Welcome to Thanks for Typing, a podcast that uncovers the largely invisible contribution of social researchers' wives to the studies that laid the foundations of modern sociology. I'm Ros Edwards and I'm a Professor of Sociology at the University of Southampton.
And I'm Val Gillies, a Professor of Social Policy at the University of Westminster.
Over the last decade, Val and I have been researching the role that the wives of social researchers played in post-war British studies. Using archive materials and diaries kept by the wives of well-known sociologists, we've been piecing together their central involvement in groundbreaking social research on families, class and community life.
In this podcast, we reveal the major but unrecognised contributions sociologist wives have made to the discipline and consider the implications of these overlooked collaborations for the development of social knowledge, both then and now.
In episode 2, we're looking at the status of wife and how the underlying institutionalisation of that status means that wives are incorporated into their husband's work. The contributions that wives make to their husband's work is forgotten, and in some cases the work that their husbands produce wouldn't exist without them. We're delighted to be joined by Anna Funder and Professor Dame Janet Finch. Anna is the Sydney-based author of Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life, a book about the marriage between George Orwell and Eileen O'Shaughnessy that was published in 2023. And Janet's an Honorary Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester and an academic administrator. She's published extensively on family relationships, including a book published in 1983 called Married to the Job, which revealed the way that marriage is an important feature of women's subordination.
So we found both of your books incredibly useful for our work on wives' contributions to post-war sociology. Anna, could you tell us a bit about your really quite eye-opening account of Orwell's wife, Eileen?
I started reading Orwell at a moment of what I started to think of in my head as peak wifedom. I had 3 kind of tweens and kind of young teenagers and a husband working very hard and often away, a husband in an equal relationship, I might say, or what we thought was. And we just moved back from the States, and it seemed like I was dealing with all the unseen, unspoken, unasked for and unthanked jobs, which kept everyone going mentally and physically and enrolled in schools and at doctors and going to the vet and the pest exterminator and everything else. So I started reading Orwell thinking he's so good at looking at power from this underdog kind of position. Maybe if I read him, I will find some way of looking at my own situation in terms of the powers at work on me as a wife. But basically, I read my way through his work and then through the 6 major biographies of him. And then I came across 6 letters from his first wife, who's barely known, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, to her best friend from their time studying at Oxford together in the early 20s. And she writes to her best friend, "I'm sorry I haven't written to you sooner. It's taken her 6 months to write to Nora. But we have quarrelled so continuously and really bitterly since the wedding that I thought I'd just write one letter to everyone once the murder or separation was accomplished." That was the moment at which I just thought, I have just finished reading 6 biographies which barely mention this brilliant Oxford-educated woman. Who is she? She's hilarious. What are they fighting about in these first months of wifedom as she gets used to her role?
Janet, I think you had a much more academic motivation and you sort of used the terms incorporated input and so on in your book, which actually I have found really, really useful in thinking about the two-way process between structure and culture and agency and so on. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about where the idea for your book came from.
Yes, certainly, and it's delightful to be asked about it now. It was published in 1983, and the research for it, the empirical research, was done before that. So we're really talking about a historical study rather than a contemporary one. But interestingly, coming back to it after a long time, and I hadn't read it for years before I started preparing for this, it still has resonances. And I'm delighted to know that the two of you are taking up these ideas again. Where did it come from? Well, it was my PhD study. So I was looking around for a topic, and this was a time in the early 1970s, actually, when I was being very influenced by the second wave of feminism. And it occurred to me that the category of wife was interesting for a lot of reasons, but I was assuming that most women like me were also in some way influenced by feminism, and that most women would be in some sort of quandary about how to build their lives with a man and not compromise on the sort of ideas that were coming through the feminist movement. I was wrong about that, I think, in lots of different ways, but it was a very good topic for a PhD. And I chose to do Wives of the Clergy because I was, for various reasons, in contact with a number of young women who were either recently married or planning to be married to clergy. And this is what I saw in them. Yes, so Wives of the Clergy was where I started. And I eventually finished it as a PhD. And after that, turned my attention to the question of whether I could publish anything from it. And it seemed to me, and this was probably very overambitious, that what was really needed was a comparative study with different occupations. Well, I wasn't in a position to initiate that, but I did manage to put together a collection of other research that was already published that had some bearing on occupations in which I might find the same sort of thing. So that's how the book came about. But it really did challenge my initial starting point, because when I first started to do interviews with wives of the clergy and really started to listen to what the women were saying, they weren't saying they were in a quandary. They were aware of the challenges put forward by feminism, the new feminism, but they weren't really embracing them in their lives. That they were doing all the things that actually that Anna just described, child raising, domestic work, but also they were doing office work, such as answering the telephone, taking messages, making cups of tea. They were looking after the church building, removing dead flowers, that sort of thing. And they were helping their husband directly to perform his duties, like preparing his robes or commenting on his sermons. There was a considerable variation in what people were doing, but it was accepted by all, I think, that this was part of being married to a clergyman.
That's absolutely really fascinating, because it does seem to me that that territory of wifedom, as Anna terms it, and of marriage, it seems to be absolutely key in wives supporting and being effaced to some extent by their husbands, and as having a hold, regardless of changes that seem to have been going on in society over many decades. I just sort of ask Anna, first of all, you draw resonances between wifedom for Orwell's wife, as you just did it in the 1930s and 40s, and your own life as a wife now. How do you think that happened? Why does that category of wife have such a hold across time?
That is the question of the book, and a question that we all are grappling with, I think. At the end of this long 7 years of writing the book and now 7 months of talking about it, I think that heterosexual marriage is still a place where gender assumptions, so what it is to be a man, a decent man, to use an Orwellian term, and what it is to be a decent woman. If you look at those terms, or what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman in a marriage, you can be a good man without doing any of that, or very much, or your fair share of the domestic and emotional labour. But if you say someone is a good woman or a decent woman or a good mother or a decent mother or a decent person and they're female, that definition of being female comprises the work. You can't really have a sense of yourself as a good person, as a woman, unless you are doing all of that work for others. You are organising Christmas, you are making sure the sheets are clean, the hair doesn't have nits, you're doing your part on the P&C at school, your ill neighbour has something to eat, or all of that work is part of the definition of what it is to be a good person in a way that it's not for a man. And I think that somewhere in that, speaking as a novelist and not as a sociologist, somewhere in those still current definitions of good men and good women is the work that means that women in heterosexual marriages are doing a lot more of it, as if it's part of what it is to be a good person. That's what I ended up thinking.
Right, thank you. Luckily, we have a sociologist with us. So, Janet, if I could turn to you. I mean, you, as you said, you developed your analysis of incorporation from a range of studies, mainly from the 60s and 70s, I think. I'm interested, it is still relevant today. Val and I are investigating these issues. I'm interested in your ideas about why it has this effect of gendered inequalities, marriage and wifedom. And also, I mean, if you have any thoughts about why it's an important topic to recover at this time.
I completely understand where Anna's coming from. As a sociologist, I want to say, I don't know whether I agree with you because we don't have the empirical evidence one way or the other. And perhaps we will have when Val and Roz have completed their work, but we don't have it now. The thing that really strikes me coming back to it is the much greater diversity of women's lives and women's intimate partnerships than I saw or than I thought I saw in the 1970s and 80s. You know, we've got huge differences. You can now be a civil partner rather than a wife. You can be married to a woman or have civil partnerships with a woman. Separation of partnerships of any sort is much easier than it was, and so on. And then we have all the questions about race and ethnicity and cultural differences. And so if I were designing a project now, it would be a very different project, because I don't know whether the situation that all women are in can be described as a single entity. But that's where I think I'm coming from.
Wives' contributions don't tend to be that easy to research, do they? Because either they are completely taken for granted or they are deliberately hidden. Anna, I'm quite interested in the process of how you untangled Eileen from Orwell's shadow.
It was very hard to find Eileen from under these 6 biographies, where even though the letters that I was looking at, just 6 of them were discovered after those biographies were all written, there was plenty of material available had the biographers been interested in the women in Orwell's life, so not just Eileen. So we kind of expect domestic work, if not the cleaning of latrines and the walking of goats, which were things that Eileen did. She was enormously important to Orwell's work, which many people said kind of in a head-scratching way after they were married, improved enormously. We can't really see why. One of the biographers says, oh, well, whether by coincidence or influence, his work got better after the wedding. You know, there are all of these ways of belittling the very obvious effect of having, I mean, Orwell never went to university, of having a brilliant Oxford English graduate who'd studied under Tolkien and others editing your work and talking with you about it and encouraging you to do it is minimized in that way. Perhaps the most extreme thing is the fact that Eileen went to the Spanish Civil War with Orwell, and the most dramatic erasure of that is in Orwell's own account in Homage to Catalonia of his time in Spain. And in that account, he mentions my wife, quote unquote, 37 times, but he never once names Eileen. No character can come to life without a name, and he won't do it. So I went and looked at what actually happened in Spain, which all the biographers ignore. DJ Taylor says, well, she went to Spain not because she was political at all, but because she wanted to be closer to her husband and to be able to procure for him, when available, treats to send to the front, like margarine, chocolate, and cigars. Full stop, that's the end of what he has to say there. Eileen was working as a bilingual secretary in the propaganda department, writing and producing propaganda at the headquarters of the political party for which Orwell was fighting. So she knew everything that was going on. She was in personal danger. She saved Orwell's life at the end of their time in Spain, and so on. These were extraordinary discoveries for me to be making, and doubly so to be looking at how the biographers either didn't look at it or following Orwell's lead, or ignored it or trivialized it. So it's almost an effortful erasure.
Yeah, so it's just so interesting. There's so many fascinating insights in your book. Janet, your research was more empirical, and of course it was much broader in focus. Did you find wives' involvement in men's work a challenging topic to research, and how did you actually go about it?
Yes, I did find it challenging, especially when I discovered I got the wrong questions at the beginning of it. It was very conventional interview-based study. So I had I can't remember how many now, about 60, I think, wives who I interviewed. in one area of the country. The reason why I found it so difficult was that when I realised that, in fact, my original presumption was that people would be finding this very difficult to reconcile feminism or growing feminist interest with what was normally expected of them. They didn't find it difficult. So according to them. So typically, and this was one of the big hooks that I hung the whole thing on, they saw it as a partnership. They recognised that they didn't have to do all the things that they did do, but they wanted to. That's out of choice. This is the way they described it. Sociologists would always sort of lift up their eyebrows and that sort of thing and say, there must be a different way of looking at this. But that was how they saw it. And so I really struggled to find a word to describe this, and that's how I became upon incorporation, because involvement wasn't quite enough. That's too neutral. I didn't want to use any word that implied that the degree of coercion in it, but I used incorporation to suggest a process. It's a process that happens. It isn't like signing a contract when you get married, where you have all the terms and conditions beforehand. It's not like that. It grows. It evolves over time. And that's how I think the best way of looking at it sociologically is. It was a process in which wives are actively engaged, but they weren't entirely in control of it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that how it happens is what I find quite valuable about that idea. I just want to circle back to you were mentioning the diversity of women's lives today. There are still these gendered inequalities and they still operate in contemporary times. Are these women who are living these other diversity of lives, are they being wives? Is it to do with being a wife, do you think, that continues on this sort of incorporation? Or do you disagree with me?
I don't know, but that's one of the key questions, I think, and it's the important reason why, if I was designing a study on this at the present time, you'd have to do it in a way which puts that diversity front and centre. I mean, it would be fascinating to discover that just being a wife makes a difference, or sometimes makes a difference. I mean, and I'm not speculating completely, but I think if you look at what happens now in the UK, if you look at a non-diverse society, you're not seeing properly. You may have evidence on a number of different individuals who see marriage as a key step and who change their behaviour subtly without really knowing it as a result of being married, as opposed to cohabiting and not being married. But I don't know whether that's the case. So I'm being cautious here.
I'm just fascinated by what Janet was saying, if I can allow myself a question to her. I'm wondering whether the church as an institution expected to get this sort of 2-for-1 deal. If you had a clergyman in a parish who was married, it would be expected by the institution in a way that the work that had to be done there was the work of 2 people, and one of them was the wife doing the flowers and helping with the sermons and making tea and coffee for parishioners and everything else. And if the clergymen weren't married, then would it be other women in the parish who would step up to do that? Or is that too speculative?
No, I wondered that too at the time. And I did actually interview, I think, 2 or 3 very senior clergy in the church who said more or less the same thing as the wives. It's a choice, but that's how they were seeing it, and it's a partnership. So that didn't get me much further, actually. I think that the reason why in the book I wanted to look at other occupations is that I think there are other occupations which have similar characteristics to the clergy, which maybe is one of the factors, though not a decisive factor, in whether some women do what I've described and others perhaps do less. So yes, I think it isn't exclusive to the church, but the structure of the context in which the marriages take place and all this happens or doesn't happen can be described in terms like if you've got a job without boundaries, or a job that's based in the home, or if you live in what used to be called a tied cottage, a house which is owned by the husband's employer and which is associated with his work. All things that I can list about 8 different factors like that, which look as if they might make the context in which certain marriages take place more likely to produce an incorporated wife or a more incorporated wife.
Earlier, Janet, you mentioned about finding a publisher and for your book, and I wonder, Anna, about publishing a book about wives. I mean, you're an established novelist, so it was perhaps a bit different for you. But do you think it was easy to interest publishers in your book?
You know, I have a very patient and extremely patient and trusting publishers in various countries, and they just probably had more faith in me than I had. It was a very big project to look at Orwell's life through this prism of 6 biographies, which occlude or omit or trivialize or disparage women, and in particular leave out Eileen's contribution to his work. So the book is doing several things. It's resurrecting Eileen from her letters and other material, and it's looking at what was really going on in the marriage that lasted 9 years and made him into the writer that he became, gave him the confidence, and certainly they co-wrote Animal Farm effectively. Then also looking at the strategies employed by the biographers, whether consciously or unconsciously, to really make Eileen and her contribution disappear almost. So yeah, the publishers were very trusting. I mean, it was until it was done, I didn't really show it to anyone because there were these strands that had to pull together in the narrative. You know, my publisher was very, very excited about it, more than I was, and I was extraordinarily relieved.
Can I just turn the conversation back to, you mentioned about Orwell's Animal Farm and the co-writing. I did want to ask a question about editing, because it is one of the key contributions that Eileen made to Orwell's work, and we're definitely finding that's the case for sociologist wives as well. They did a lot of editing. I did wonder about the difference between editing and writing, because it can be quite a blurred distinction, and particularly when it comes to projects that wives are so intimately involved in. So I just wondered, do you think, is there sometimes a strategic downplaying of wives' intellectual labour by calling it editing, do you think?
So just to take the case of Animal Farm, and this is not new work of mine, this is alluded to in the biographies. Again, this is something that Orwell himself, after Eileen died, she died before Animal Farm was published, very sadly. He played down her contribution enormously. He said to a friend, it's a shame she didn't live to see the publication of it, because she even helped in the planning of it, which is to catastrophically and astonishingly minimize her contribution. Eileen said of Orwell that he had a remarkable political simplicity. She was a very sophisticated thinker. One of the biographers, Sir Bernard Crick, couldn't bear that, and he republished that quote. He simply rewrote it and said that Eileen said that Orwell had a remarkable political sympathy. But Orwell, with his political simplicity, wanted to publish an essay critical of Stalin at the height of World War II, after the Blitz in London, and London was still very much under attack. And Stalin, as we know, was helping the Allies win the war. Eileen was working to support the two of them financially at the Department of Censorship in the Ministry of Information at Whitehall. She said, that will never be published. You cannot write at this point in the war an essay critical of Stalin. So I don't know how the rest of that conversation went, but the upshot of it was that they conceived together the novel Animal Farm. And by the time they were writing it, she was continuing to work to support them in the Ministry of Food. And she worked there with a rather wonderfully named woman who was a graduate in classics from Oxford and a novelist, wonderfully named for working at the Ministry of Food. Her name was Lettice Cooper. And she has a terrific account of how it was in the writing of Animal Farm. So every day Eileen would come into work and regale them with the next instalment. Then she would go and shop at lunchtime for what they were going to eat, go home after work, cook it for whichever friends had been bombed out or whoever was there. And then after that, Eileen and Orwell would get into bed, because that was the only place they could stay warm enough. They couldn't afford to heat the flat, and work on the book going forward, work on what he'd done that day and what was going to come. So it's a very intimate process, step by step, page by page, day by day, from the concept of the book as a novel. So she's got the sense of wit and whimsy that imbues Animal Farm. He thought it was the best of his work. His publisher, Frederick Warburg, who knew Eileen and liked her, says when he reads Animal Farm, he simply couldn't understand it. He said it was as if the writer of rather grey novels had suddenly taken wings and become a poet. So all of Orwell's other work has an underdog, grumpy, disgruntled, funny stand-in Orwell character in it. Animal Farm has a cast of characters, including female characters, who are deftly, swiftly, acutely drawn, as well as being this beautiful little political fable. So her work there was much more extensive than editing and typing, which I'm sure she also did.
That's such fascinating detail, again, about the process of how this happens, Anna. Janet, you've long been part of the academic world, and I wondered whether you thought there was anything in particular about the contributions of wives of academics that you've picked up on over the years.
I think there is, and I think the question really is about how much it's changed. As a result, actually, one of the things I didn't mention before was as a result of more women being in the labour force and having jobs as a normal part of their lives. Because if we're talking about wives now of academics, I'd be fascinated to know what sort of incorporation there might still be. In the past, you certainly could find people who were prominent sociologists and other types of academics who were seeing their marriage as a partnership and wives were entertaining postgraduate students, that sort of thing, and sometimes helping with the office work. But now I don't know. I think you'd be much less likely to find people who are doing that now, because many women have a commitment to employment as well as to a marriage or a partnership. So I do think that there is scope for wives to do things which we would now regard as incorporation in their husbands' work. There probably still is scope, but whether a lot of people take that up, I don't know.
Certainly from the work that Val and I have been doing, looking into the past, I think the university also incorporated wives into its daily sort of running, if you like. I think there were university wives clubs and for some universities, and that, as you say, there was the expectation that wives would be entertaining postgraduate students and perhaps their own wives as well, which isn't so overt today.
No, it isn't, and there are a number of reasons for that. But the employment of women, I think, is an important one there.
One of the things I get concerned about is because we're doing this work, it doesn't mean to say that we're diminishing the work of Dennis Marsden, Peter Townsend, or Peter Wilmot. We're not trying to do that. It's to sort of put them alongside.
I understand that very much.
People kind of subsume the work that women do, as you say, as typing or as editing or as domestic or as emotional. But really what Eileen was doing, she was teaching Orwell. She was guiding him, mentoring him, supporting him financially. But really she was an intellectual lodestar. And it seems to me, as well as doing all of the practical things, it kind of seems that it's very hard for people to accept that. It's hard to say, we've got this genius man, but actually he really needed his wife, who was at least as smart and in many ways smarter. But we can't talk about that because it is as if to diminish him in some way. It doesn't affect the work at all. We can all enjoy Animal Farm even more when we know its origins, and you can. In my book, you can see really clearly her voice in her letters is the same as the sort of tone of whimsy in Animal Farm. So it takes nothing away from that. We're still running up against this patriarchal expectation of men, even though it's not possible and it's not actually what happens. So in order to have the fantasy that they do it all alone, you have to have a lot of belittling, ignoring, minimizing, or in fact saying, oh, she must have been happy and consented to it, which I guess goes a bit back to what Janet was saying. So there's consent and consent. You can consent to things when you've got no option and make a good fist of your life in a patriarchal world, or there's real consent, which means you've got to have options. So I don't know, I was interested in all of those non-sociological questions.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating, so interesting for Val and I to be able to talk to you both and to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks to our guests, Anna Funder and Janet Finch, and thank you to you for listening. Thanks also to Chris Garrington and Chrissy Brighty-Gover, our production team at Research Podcasts. In our next episode, we'll be looking at wives in the archives with archivist Sophie Bridges, who's been researching the personal papers of people involved in social research, including Michael Young and Phyllis Wilmot. We'll also be joined by Chris Renwick from the University of York, who's explored the crucial role that Peter Townsend's wife Ruth played in his career and research.
Thanks for Typing is brought to you in partnership with the Sociological Review Foundation, whose mission is to share sociologically imaginative insights on our world and help pave the way towards a more just future. Find out more about all of the Foundation's podcasts at thesociologicalreview.org.